So this is a presentation that really tries to think through how design thinking fits into the whole sort of entrepreneurial process. A little bit about me. I spent about 10 years practicing law in a variety of settings. My last venture was at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. I ran a unit in the DA's office that interacted with leaders all over the city of Philadelphia, basically working on public nuisances. And I got really interested in leadership and the impact of leadership on quality of life. And that led me to a Kellogg Foundation Fellowship, which was a 3-year intensive experience really studying leadership and leadership development. And I got so excited about what I learned that I decided I don't want to practice law anymore. And I created this organization, the Institute for Leadership Education. And our mission originally was to bring the best leadership development practices to community-based organizations and to communities, particularly low-income communities, because I felt that, the people that I was seeing in the world and the struggles that they were having, that they could enormously benefit from the education that I had received that was going to people who were sort of at the top of their profession and not filtering down into neighborhoods. I ultimately got interested in developing social enterprises and looking at earned revenue models to run my own organization. And that led me to the work that that has been really probably the work that has consumed most of my career, which is this venture that we run called Achieve College Education, which is what we do is we form partnerships between higher ed and neighborhood organizations to bring college to underserved communities. It's got a terrific business model, and it really has helped my organization to scale and really survive over now many years. That work led me to being a Ashoka Fellow and took me into a sort of deep dialogue with other innovators across the country. I also run an international podcast called Innovate Podcast, where we interview social innovators around the whole world. So I've also had a chance to talk to probably over 100 different people doing innovations in different spaces, all kinds of different problems. And so that has been fascinating and has shaped, how I see all this stuff. So when you're in this space, people throw around a lot of different language. You hear about entrepreneurship, you hear about social entrepreneurship, design thinking, the whole subject of innovation, of change making, this idea of disruption, systems thinking. So, it's a lot of lingo, and I find that a lot of times people get lost in the lingo, and we're not really sure what we're doing, how we're doing it, what's the pathway, what's the right set of tools. So I want to try to suggest to you a framework for thinking about, your own approach to your own venture. So the first idea is a very primary idea. This is an idea that's really advanced by Ashoka internationally, which is just the idea of change making. If you were going to go and talk to Bill Drayton, he would say, being a change maker is the most important thing in the world right now, learning how to be a change maker. And so I think it's important to start with just the idea of change, and it's really hard to change anything in the world if you're not really familiar with the patterns that are in the world. And so it's recognizing and becoming mindful to the fact that there's a lot of things that happen in certain ways, and really observing clearly the ways in which the things that are going on in the universe happen. And I say that because a lot of times when I'm dealing with innovators, they haven't bothered to really think through how things are actually happening now. If you don't understand how things are happening now, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to change the pattern. I would also suggest that a lot of the changes that we experience in our lives are changes that are not necessarily good. And so change making itself is not the be all and end all. Say, well, I'm changing a pattern. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you made progress. A lot of things in our life change, and they change for the worse. I think we're seeing that right now in the middle of this pandemic, so many things. So the idea of innovation really emerges out of the idea of change making, which is, to say, can you make a change that some people experience as an improvement, and that's much harder to do than I think one might imagine. A lot of times when you change things, you may have noticed this, that when people are in an environment that's changing, the first thing they experience is that it's unpleasant, that they don't like it because what they used to do, now they can't do. And you could see this, for example, in the Healthcare Act when Barack Obama was trying to change people's insurance policies. A lot of people are like, hey, I like my insurance policy the way it is. Please don't change it. And a lot of blowback from that. So one of the things when you're thinking about change is to try to imagine, and I think this is embedded in design thinking, to imagine what it is, how is that change experienced by the people who are in the world. And so this gets to the whole idea of change versus innovation. Not all change is innovation. You can move things around. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's equal, sometimes it's a meaningless change. But on the other hand, you sometimes get changes that are real innovations. So thinking about change versus innovation, I think, is really an important sort of place to start. Is my change an innovation? And to whom is it an innovation? How does it make the world better, so to speak? Then you get to the idea of, and this is a big idea in the field, of disruptive innovation. And I would say that not all innovation is disruptive. So, like, I would take my program as a result. We bring college to underserved communities who are not part of the market before we came. We didn't disrupt anything. Nobody's hurt by our innovation. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, wow, I can't believe that iLead is doing its work. So I wouldn't describe my venture as a disruptive innovation. But imagine, like, for example, these three companies. Uber, as an example. That is a very disruptive innovation. If you've ever talked to somebody that paid $50,000 for a taxi medallion, they are disrupted. They are severely injured by Uber. Their business is terrible now. So, it used to be I had a great business. Now I don't have a business. Very disruptive, but of course, also for some people, an enormous innovation. So I'm not saying that Uber isn't a powerful, good idea, but I'm just saying it's definitely disruptive. Amazon would be another example, very obvious example, but think about the number of organizations that have been disrupted by Amazon. Think about the fact that Sears, no longer exists. It's like out of business because of Amazon. Malls destroyed by Amazon. So Amazon has been a really disruptive force in the marketplace and caused a lot of people's business models to go under. Google, of course, if a lot of people understand this, if they think deeply about it, Google has caused the demise of newspapers across the entire country. Newspapers used to be the most powerful businesses in America. There's no such thing anymore as newspapers, largely because of Google. Google does what they used to do much better, much less expensively, and across the whole country. And so it is a very disruptive innovator in the marketplace. So when you're thinking about your venture, you can think about one question you can ask yourself is my change an innovation, and is my innovation disruptive? If my innovation is disruptive, it may create certain kinds of blowback. It may create certain kinds of problems that you want to be aware of, as you're executing and developing. So now we get to the idea of, we're going to add this very important word here, social innovation. And I think social innovation has a certain fundamental idea behind it, which is that we're looking not just at a user base, not just at a client, but we're looking at problems in the community as a whole. So if we're calling our innovation a social innovation, what we're saying is we have some concern for the larger context, in which our work is ongoing. And how do we think about that? How do we frame that? And I think what we're going to see is that idea of thinking about the whole, thinking about the community as a whole, is a really primary aspect of the difference between social innovation and other kinds of innovation. I often think about the innovations that have taken place in airlines, right? Airline travel is, for the airline, at least it was up until the pandemic, it was much more profitable. It was getting more and more targeted. So you might have noticed that, when you traveled 10 years ago, it was often on a plane where there was plenty of room. Now, you can rarely go anywhere without having the plane completely full of people. I would argue that's a great innovation for the airline. It's a terrible innovation for customers. I mean, you're packed in like a sardine. So that's not a social innovation. That's an innovation that helps their business model, but it doesn't make the world better for anybody except them. You know, you may have noticed that things in the computer world, in the world of computers and cell phones, things get less expensive and more powerful over time. In the travel industry, things have not gotten better. They have gotten more expensive, and they've gotten less comfortable and less valuable. So you could look at this and you could see that social innovation is not congruent with innovation. Obvious, but you know, an important thing to think about. So here's just a few examples of, I think, some of the great social innovators in the world, some that we maybe don't think about. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, gave that technology away. Imagine if Tim Berners-Lee had decided to try to get intellectual property protection on his invention. He'd probably be one of the wealthiest people on earth. If he had been able to license that, he just created that technology and gave it away. Craigslist, again, you probably don't think of Craigslist very much, something that you might use periodically in your life. Craigslist took what was classified advertising, which was one of the most robust business models in newspapers, and turned it into a free product on the internet, destroyed the core business of newspapers across the entire country. Craig Newmark, who's actually a very wealthy guy now, he's a billionaire. He's a billionaire because he took one tiny piece of his business and sold it, which is he sells advertising for jobs. He makes so much money out of that while giving away just about everything else that Craigslist does. So it's a very interesting example of a new technology turning something that was a business model into a free product, making somebody very rich at the same time that he disrupted the entire industry. The last one is Wikipedia. I think is a really interesting case to think about. Microsoft had a product. They sold people an encyclopedia, that came to you on CD discs. And then, of course, if you go back, I'm really going to show my age now. You used to actually sell physical encyclopedias. The person would come door to door and sell you an encyclopedia. Again, Jimmy Wales, Wikipedia, he creates the encyclopedia, the mother of all encyclopedias, using volunteers on the internet. It's a miracle. It's miraculous, and a miraculous use of the internet to provide background information about everything. Nobody in their right mind with an internet connection would buy an encyclopedia today. So these are, I think, examples, and there are just many more of social innovations. And I call them social innovations because these folks are primarily not interested in making money. If they were interested in making money, they could have made a lot more money than they did. They primarily are interested in solving a problem for human beings. So this is something that I think it's helpful to think about, which is the kinds of organizations, and you might even want to study this because it helps. It has helped me to think about the context for any particular piece of work. So you recognize that you live in a world where you have these different types of funders. You have public sector funders, for-profit funders, traditional nonprofits, and social entrepreneurs. And what you can see is that there is a vastly different expectation around the use of the funds, the expectation of what is going to be derived in return, the idea of control and ownership changes in the different columns, and fundamentally the purpose. And I think it's, as you're thinking about your venture, this is a good thing to think about. Like, is my venture better funded through a grant? Is it better funded as a for-profit? Should I structure it as a traditional nonprofit organization, or should I think about it as a social enterprise? These are very different presentations, and they really can have a huge impact on the future of your venture. So if you build your venture as a traditional nonprofit, that's like a fork in the road. A lot of people, I think, just sort of leap over this question. They maybe have ideas that could be terrific for-profit businesses or could be terrific social ventures, but they're going to put them into one of these other columns because that's the column that they know well, you know. So you really want to think hard about this and make a conscious choice which paradigm fits and which paradigm is best for scaling my organization. I would argue that there are some things that can only be done in one of these segments, and then there are some ideas that could be done in any of them, and then there are some ideas that could be done hybrid, you know, across the different columns. So again, in my experience, people aren't always conscious of the choices that they're making in that staging of how they're going to raise money and what the expectations are when they do. I think that, you know, in the world, the NGO world that we live in today, this model kind of dominates. This is the traditional model where people give us money to do things and then we give them back reports. That's sort of the fundamental paradigm. Do you like what you see? You know, did I prove to you that I did what you wanted to do? And if I did, the idea is that I'm going to scale because you're going to give me more money because you like the paper that I gave you back. You like the report. This model is why evaluators are making so much money today, because you know, evaluators are the independent sort of arbiters of whether your idea worked or not. Of course, you think it worked. Do you have an evaluator who says that it worked? If you do, then you get more money. That's the sort of baseline mental model. Social entrepreneurs, I think, are trying to work in an extremely different model. They're not interested necessarily in that model about where you give me money, I do something, and then I give you a report. They're trying to build a business. In a social venture, you're looking at the marketplace the way an entrepreneur would look at it. You're seeing what the demand is. You're looking at the competition, and then you're deciding, can you make an investment of talent and funds and resources, produce something and have people pay for it? And can the money that you generate support your venture? And so you get this little circle. This is obviously kind of trying to suggest to you the simple business model of a farm or a community garden. You know, almost everything in the world that's not a nonprofit has a business model. I think it's worth really thinking hard and answering the question, if you think of yourself as a social entrepreneur, what is your business model? If you can't answer that question, then you probably are not doing social entrepreneurship. You're doing traditional nonprofit stuff. I gave you 3 examples of what I would describe, these are real social ventures. The Grameen Bank, you know, a lot of people understand the Grameen Bank. Oh, they give microloans. That's not what makes the Grameen Bank exciting to me. What makes it exciting is that it's profitable. The Grameen Bank makes money giving loans to poor people. That's pretty amazing. That's something that nobody would have thought was possible. How do they do it? Well, the dirty little secret is that they do it by charging a tremendous amount of interest, much bigger interest than you would ever believe. So these people, these very poor people, pay a lot of interest to the Grameen Bank, and that's why it worked, because the Grameen Bank was able to make a lot of money giving loans to poor people. First book, really interesting venture, little known, operating on a little known factoid that, you know, publishers trash an enormous volume of books for children. What did First Book do? They took that garbage, basically the things that the publishers were throwing away, dropped the price point on it enormously, and sold it again to the low-income market. So First Book is a profitable nonprofit. It makes money selling books at very low cost to low-income people. And it's actually an amazing company. Anybody that's going to do social entrepreneurship, I'd encourage you to look at the First Book business model. Carbon Roots, another really interesting company. You know, they're operating in places where what they do is they take agricultural waste and they make charcoal out of it. And this is much better for the environment But again, the key thing is that the promise of Carbon Roots is that they can actually make money doing this so that they won't have to rely on grant funds. Change the pattern in a way that's innovative, that supports the community, and do it with a business model. To me, that's what social entrepreneurship is. So I have a few slides here at the end to kind of summarize, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to try to kind of whiz through these, and maybe we can have a conversation, dialogue about this. But so, customers, just looking at what's the difference between traditional and social entrepreneurs. A traditional entrepreneur is going to build his company around the people who can pay, and he's going to try to serve the market that can pay the most. So that is really, and generally not too much concern about inequity or equality or injustice. I think a social entrepreneur has a broader focus in creating value, and they're looking not only at the customer, but they're looking about how do I advantage somebody that was disadvantaged? How do I create value for the society as a whole? So that is a very different vision of what your customer is. The customer vision in social entrepreneurship is broader. I like to think of, this, I think AA is one of the greatest examples of social entrepreneurship in action. Compare the work of AA to a private drug rehab center. They're both in the same mission. They're both trying to help people recover. To get into the private drug rehab, you have to pay a fortune. You have to have some really great insurance. To go to AA, you just have to show up at the church, right? AA is arguably equally or more impactful than private rehabs. There's been, I think, a study even released recently that shows that it's more effective, and yet it is operated almost completely by volunteers operating out of places like church basements. The vision of AA does not rely on grant money to support its mission. It relies on volunteership and small contributions from individual addicts who have, who belong to the organization. Investors, again, the traditional concept in traditional business of an investor is somebody who gets their money back, and they get a return on their investment. In the social entrepreneurship arena, that's not true. Investors are willing to give you an investment based not only on your on getting a return, but also on making an impact. So that's the idea of the B Corp, the social company, is that I might invest dollars and not get as much of a return because I like what you're trying to do. And so think of the difference between Goldman Sachs and Ashoka, in that regard. In Goldman Sachs, you can bet that they're focused on one thing, which is profit. In Ashoka, they are focused on making investments that lead to the innovation for the public good. And then, finally, on the strategies, I would say that the strategy of a traditional entrepreneur is to focus on the business model, making improvements to the business model to make it more profitable, and ultimately dominating a market segment. In a social entrepreneur has a broader focus. They're focused on the underserved part of the market. They're focused on looking at externalities, things that are bad for society that are produced by a particular business model. They look at the social goods as well as the goods that are created to the client. And what's really interesting is at the end of the day, they're not that concerned about competition. Maybe they want to just give away their model. They're willing to move towards a commodity pricing structure. They want to accelerate market efficiencies. So they are people applying entrepreneurial ideas, but not for the purpose of getting wealthy. So again, look at the difference between Linux and Apple. Linux, we don't see it that as much in the United States, but it certainly is a force. But if we were in Europe, we would see a lot of people using Linux-based systems where this guy, Linus Torvalds, he gives away his operating system, creates a whole universe that's a counter universe to the Windows, Apple, operating environment. and a whole economy based on free software that's open source, given away. What's the difference between that and I think of Linux, Torvalds as an enormous social entrepreneur in the computer space. With Apple, you're looking at everything proprietary. You're in a proprietary ecosystem. Everything's very expensive. They're focused on dominating a market, protecting their intellectual property, right? You know, so you see very different background ideas. Scaling is a really important idea in the social venture space. And it's the idea of, can I grow something? Can I multiply it and have the business model continue to work? It's usually very easy for people to do something good for a small number of people. As you scale it, it becomes harder and harder. One of the things that I often test with people is we say, you know, people say, oh, I got a good idea. I was able to raise some money. Well, how are we going to serve more people? We're going to raise more money. You know, if your theory of scaling is more and more money being raised, you really need to look at your business model. It's probably not going to work. Okay. Anything that really scales effectively has an internal business model that is working, that doesn't require you to continue to raise grant funds. So now we can put design thinking in context, you know, and design thinking is a powerful piece of work. And I think of design thinking as being something that's embedded in your business model development. Design thinking is part of how you build an amazing business model. And because what it really focuses on, and I think, you know, the pieces that I saw were dead on target, bullseye, you know, is that you're looking at seeing the world through the eyes of your client. Empathy is really a critical component of design thinking. I'll just use the example of my venture. One of the things that we realized is in our venture is that, you know, most people a lot of people in the market who are underserved for education are low wage employed with family members. And that means that the best way to serve them is in their community close to where they live. So you could say that our whole innovation really is premised on the idea of bringing college into the community where somebody lives, so that at the end of a work shift, they don't have to travel 45 minutes to an hour. They are only traveling 10 or 15 minutes, and they're going to a community-based organization near their house to go to college. That's one of the essential ideas, which is all built around customer convenience, you know. This kind of idea of seeing the actual problems that your client's experiencing and innovating off of those things that are problems for them, that's a key, probably I think the most fundamental idea of design thinking. Then these other things about testing and prototyping obviously are critical, because it's getting real world feedback, you know, and understanding, you know, how your innovation, does it cause disruption? How does it cause disruption? Does it have unintended consequences? You know, how do people actually experience? What do they like? What do they not like? You know, and don't scale something until you know that it works. So, you know, design thinking is what built the modern cell phone, you know, bringing all these products. I mean, I still find it miraculous. I know my kids don't, but I find it miraculous that you've got your camera, your television, your music player, your phone, and your computer all stuffed into your cell phone. You know, that's design thinking. Finally, I want to mention and give a shout out to systems thinking, which is often, I think, confused with design thinking. Systems thinking is a really rigorous approach to complexity and to developing strategy. And, you know, after you have your design, when you're trying to build your business, you will encounter numerous problems that yield not necessarily to design thinking, but to systems thinking, which is really about, it's a way of managing complexity and looking at feedback and looking at all of the variables in a situation that you're in, and understanding how they work together or don't work together to help you advance your goal. So you could think of this as maybe an overview of the language and concepts in the field, and some ideas about how they fit together. And that's my presentation.